A dedicated nurse transformed the life of a powerful businessman. When he discovered she had saved his wife years before, a connection from the past united their destinies, and secrets came to light, changing their lives forever in ways no one could have predicted. A story of overcoming, redemption, and love. Prepare yourself because this story will touch your heart. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like on this video and comment where you're watching from. The metallic sound of medication trays clattering against the cart echoed down the 6th-floor hallway of Mercy Grace Hospital, mixing with the constant hum of machines keeping temporary residents alive. Sarah Winters adjusted her badge as she watched the sunset filtered through the blinds of room 612. Her hands, weathered by 20 years of service, worked with the precision of a watchmaker as she changed the IV drip. Sometimes true strength isn't found in withstanding life's blows, but in how we choose to care for others when we ourselves are wounded, she whispered to the elderly man dozing before her, though the words seemed more a reminder to herself. The 52-year-old nurse couldn't imagine that on this January afternoon, as she performed her daily ritual of personalized care, the universe was rearranging the pieces of her destiny on an invisible board. Nor did she know that 3 rooms down in the hospital's presidential suite, observant eyes were following her every move through the half-open door. The clock read 6:42 p.m. when firm footsteps and the unmistakable scent of expensive cologne announced the arrival of Richard Blackwell, Chief Administrator of Mercy Grace Hospital, accompanied by 3 resident physicians who followed him like a trail of insecurity and ambition. "Nurse Winters," Blackwell's voice cut through the air with surgical precision, "could you explain why you've spent 15 minutes in this room when our new time optimization protocol clearly states a maximum of 7 minutes per patient?" Sarah rose slowly, with the dignity of someone who knows their own worth. The silence in the hallway grew thick as the residents exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Mr. Blackwell, Mr." Jenkins was showing signs of anxiety, and his blood pressure was elevated. "I considered it necessary to extend the care time to—" "What you consider necessary ceased to be relevant when we implemented the new system," Blackwell interrupted, deliberately raising his voice. "This hospital cannot afford the luxury of maintaining obsolete practices. Every extra minute you spend with one patient is a resource wasted for another." The words hung like darts in the climate-controlled air. A novice nurse passing by with a tray of samples stopped, paralyzed by the tension. 2 administrative assistants peered out from the nursing station. Sarah felt a flush creep up her neck, not from embarrassment, but from indignation contained for too long. "With all due respect, sir, I don't consider treating a human being with dignity to be a wasted resource," she responded, with a calm but firm voice. Blackwell's smile transformed into a tense line. "Your romantic idealism is out of place in modern medicine, Winters. This hospital treats over 200 patients daily and survives thanks to efficiency, not fairy tales about personalized care. If you can't adapt to our current standards, perhaps you should reconsider your position here." The administrator turned, satisfied with his demonstration of authority, when a deep, measured voice emerged from the presidential suite doorway. "Excuse me, did you just threaten to fire a nurse for properly caring for a patient?" Maxwell Harrison, the suite's occupant, advanced toward the group with the bearing that only comes from decades of unchallenged power. At 62, the businessman maintained an imposing presence despite the hospital gown and portable heart monitor hanging around his neck. Blackwell's expression instantly changed. "Mr. Harrison, you shouldn't be up. Please allow me to escort you back to your—" "You haven't answered my question, Mr. Blackwell," Harrison insisted, leaning slightly against the doorframe. "Is it hospital policy to punish excellence in human care?" The hallway had become an impromptu theater. Sarah watched the scene with a mixture of amazement and apprehension, aware that this chance encounter was about to alter the course of many lives, especially hers. Sarah Winters' life could be summarized in one constant: caring. Since she could remember, her hands seemed destined to alleviate others' pain. First her father, a factory worker with chronic emphysema, then her younger brother with a congenital disability, and now her mother, Eleanor, 78, who battled rheumatoid arthritis in a body that refused to surrender. That January morning, while preparing Eleanor's special breakfast, oatmeal with cinnamon and honey as every Thursday, Sarah mentally reviewed the list of medications she needed to pick up at the insurance pharmacy. The modest two-bedroom apartment in the Hopewood neighborhood was a silent testament to a life built on sacrifices and small joys. "That uniform again, honey?" Eleanor's voice sounded concerned from the kitchen table. "It seems each washing takes a little more color away." Sarah smiled while serving the oatmeal in a ceramic bowl decorated with wildflowers, a gift from a cancer patient who had survived against all odds. "It's the same as always, Mom. You're just looking at it with your designer eyes now," she joked, referring to the knitting classes Eleanor had started taking at the community center. The reality, which Sarah carefully concealed, was that she had postponed buying new uniforms to pay for the hydrotherapy that eased her mother's pain. In 20 years as a nurse at Mercy Grace Hospital, she had risen from assistant to become one of the most respected nurses at the medical center. However, professional respect rarely translated into fair compensation. "Thomas called last night while you were sleeping," Eleanor commented, tasting the oatmeal. "Says he has a contact at North Valley Private Clinic. You could earn twice as much." Thomas Kirkland, a childhood friend and current head nurse at an exclusive clinic, had spent years trying to convince Sarah to leave the public hospital. "Mercy Grace is my home, Mom. I know every corner, every procedure. My patients need me there. Your patients will need you wherever you are, Sarah. And your mother needs you to think a little more about yourself." Sarah observed Eleanor's deformed hands, struggling to hold the spoon, those hands that had once sewn school uniforms for the entire family, that had prepared homemade bread to sell when her father's salary wasn't enough, now fought to perform the simplest tasks. "I'll have enough time to think about myself when I retire," she replied, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Now I need to hurry or I'll be late for my shift." The bus ride to Mercy Grace Hospital took 45 minutes on good days. That Thursday, a demonstration downtown extended the trip to almost an hour and 20. Sarah used the time to review her patients' files on the tablet the hospital provided its staff, though the connection constantly failed. The case that concerned her most was that of Ruth Vandermill, an 82-year-old woman with pneumonia complicated by uncontrolled diabetes. The latest tests showed worrying values, but the attending physician, Dr. Oliver, seemed more interested in meeting his patient quota than listening to nursing observations. Upon arriving at the imposing 12-story building that housed Mercy Grace Hospital, Sarah took a deep breath. The former pride of working at the most prestigious medical institution in the region had gradually transformed into a bittersweet sensation. The recent resource optimization policies implemented by Blackwell were changing the hospital's soul. "Winters, you're just in time for the chaos," greeted Laura Bennett, head nurse of the morning shift, a 60-year-old woman with a perfect braid and eyes that seemed to have seen everything in the world of medicine. "What's happening, Laura?" "We have a big fish in the presidential suite. Maxwell Harrison, the businessman, admitted last night with chest pain, probably stress, but you know how these millionaires are. 3 specialist physicians, tests at all hours, and we're running around to attend to him while keeping the rest of the hospital functioning," Sarah completed, while signing in on the digital register. "Exactly. By the way, Blackwell will be breathing down our necks all day. Seems Harrison is considering a major donation for the new oncology wing." "I understand. Any other news?" Laura lowered her voice, moving closer to Sarah. "The new time protocols take effect today. 7 minutes per patient recorded in the app. The system will send alerts if you exceed that." Sarah's expression darkened. 7 minutes to change a catheter, administer medication, check vital signs, update the record, and, I don't know, maybe treat the patient like a human being. "You know what our dear administrator would say. Efficiency is the new compassion," Laura replied with barely disguised sarcasm. "Be careful, Sarah. You've been on his radar since you questioned the custodial staff cuts last month." With a sigh, Sarah headed to the locker room. While changing, she mentally reviewed the faces of her regular patients, wondering how she could provide the care they deserved within the confines of those ruthless 7 minutes. What Sarah didn't know was that on that day, her ability to balance compassion and efficiency would be tested like never before. Maxwell Harrison contemplated the city from the window of the presidential suite at Mercy Grace Hospital with the gaze of someone accustomed to the world bending to his will. However, the heart monitor he wore connected, reminded him of a truth that no fortune could change. His body, that imperfect vehicle, was beginning to show the effects of decades of stress and questionable decisions. "Ridiculous," he muttered to himself, adjusting the hospital gown he considered an unnecessary indignity. "A simple stress episode, and everyone acts as if I'm at death's door." The phone on the side table vibrated for the 10th time that morning. Margaret, his personal assistant for the past 15 years, kept sending messages about postponed meetings, documents pending signature, and most importantly, the status of negotiations with the Asian consortium that could save his financial empire from collapse. Because that was the truth that no one except his inner circle knew. Harrison Enterprises, the conglomerate he had built from scratch over 4 decades, was on the brink of bankruptcy. The pandemic, bad investments in the energy sector, and the betrayal of his main partner had created the perfect storm. Maxwell scrolled through the latest emails. His face, carved by 62 years of iron determination, betrayed none of the anxiety eating away inside. 3,500 employees depended on him finding a solution. 3,500 families. The irony wasn't lost on him. He, who had built his reputation by being ruthless in business, now worried about the fate of people whose names he would never know. "Mr. Harrison, it's time for your medication," announced a young nurse from the door, holding a tray with meticulously organized pills. "Come in," he responded dryly, locking his phone. The young woman, Maxwell noticed her badge read Nurse Jessica Miller, resident, approached with the nervous efficiency of someone afraid of making a mistake in front of an important person. "Dr. Matthews will be by in approximately an hour to review your latest test results," she informed him as she handed him the pills and a glass of water. "Do you need anything else in the meantime?" "Information," Maxwell replied after swallowing the medicines. "Who is the most experienced nurse on this floor?" The question seemed to throw the young woman off balance. "Well, that would be Sarah Winters, sir. She's been at the hospital for over 20 years. "And is she on duty today?" "Yes, sir. In fact, she's in charge of supervising this hallway. But since you're in the presidential suite, I was specifically assigned to—" "I'd prefer that she directly oversee my medical care," Maxwell interrupted, with the tone of someone accustomed to his preferences instantly becoming reality. "I would have to check with the head nurse and probably administration, Mr. Harrison. The protocol for the presidential suite states that—" "Young lady," Maxwell's voice acquired an almost imperceptible edge, "in my companies I have a simple rule. I always seek the best person for each task. If this Sarah Winters is the most experienced, I want her to supervise my stay here." The resident nurse nodded nervously. "I'll communicate your request immediately, Mr. Harrison." When the young woman left, Maxwell returned his attention to his phone. Among Margaret's messages, he found one from his son Ethan, the only one of his 3 children who didn't work in the family empire. "How are you, Dad? Natalie and I can visit this afternoon if the doctors allow." An unexpected smile softened the businessman's face. Ethan, with his decision to become a university professor instead of an executive, had been an initial disappointment that, over time, had transformed into a strange pride. At least one of his children had chosen his own path. The sound of raised voices in the hallway caught his attention. Maxwell approached the half-open door of his room and observed the scene. A man in an expensive suit, clearly some type of executive, was publicly reprimanding a middle-aged nurse who maintained a serene dignity in the face of humiliation. Indignation bubbled in Maxwell's chest. Throughout his career, he had witnessed countless abuses of power, and had even perpetrated some. But something about the injustice of that moment, about the vulnerability masked by strength in that woman, touched a sensitive fiber he thought dormant. Without thinking twice, he stepped into the hallway. "Excuse me, did you just threaten to fire a nurse for properly caring for a patient?" The words left his mouth before he could consider the implications. The face of the man who was scolding the nurse instantly changed, showing the artificial smile reserved for the powerful. At that moment, Maxwell was certain he had found something much more valuable than a potential beneficiary for his philanthropic donation. He had found a cause that could give meaning to what might be his last months of relevance in the business world. "Do you have a moment, Mr. Harrison?" Richard Blackwell's voice distilled a mixture of servility and barely contained tension as he followed Maxwell back to the presidential suite. The businessman sat in the armchair by the window, indicating with a gesture that the administrator could take the seat across from him. A strategic silence settled in the room. Maxwell had perfected this art over decades of negotiations. Letting the other person speak first always revealed more than necessary. "I deeply regret some misunderstanding you just witnessed," Blackwell began, smoothing an imaginary wrinkle in his pants. "I must clarify that at Mercy Grace, we greatly value the work of our nursing staff. Enough to humiliate them publicly?" The question hung in the air like a knife. Blackwell smiled nervously. "What you witnessed was simply a conversation about our new efficiency protocols. Mercy Grace Hospital is implementing a revolutionary time management system that will allow us to treat 15% more patients with the same resources." "Fascinating," Maxwell replied with irony. "And does this revolutionary system include treating your staff like defective machines?" The administrator shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Mr. Harrison, I run this hospital as you would run one of your companies, prioritizing results and optimizing resources. Surely you understand that in today's world, efficiency is—" "Don't compare your management style to mine, Mr. Blackwell," Maxwell interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "In my companies, talent is the most valuable asset. I would never humiliate an exceptional employee in front of their colleagues. It's counterproductive and, frankly, shows a surprising lack of emotional intelligence in someone in your position." Blackwell paled slightly. They both knew that the donation Maxwell had been considering for the new oncology wing, $5 million according to rumors, now hung by an invisible thread. "I appreciate your frankness, Mr. Harrison," Blackwell finally responded. "I assure you that the situation with Nurse Winters is complex. She's an excellent professional, but sometimes her attachment to traditional methods conflicts with the needs of a modern hospital. I want her to be my assigned nurse during my stay," Maxwell declared, unexpectedly changing the subject. "Excuse me? Nurse Winters, I want her to supervise my medical care while I'm here." The administrator opened his mouth and closed it again, quickly calculating his options. "Of course, Mr. Harrison. It will be a pleasure to accommodate your request. Though I should mention that we have nurses specialized in VIP care who are more accustomed to the requirements of the presidential suite. I'm not looking to be treated as a VIP, Mr. Blackwell. I'm looking to be treated as a patient who deserves the best possible medical care. And from what I just witnessed, that woman is precisely who can provide it." In another part of the hospital, unaware of the conversation that would determine her immediate future, Sarah Winters was trying to compose herself in the small supply room on the 6th floor. Blackwell's words still echoed in her mind, mixing with more pressing concerns. Eleanor's next therapy session, the overdue building maintenance payment, the scholarship application form for the palliative care specialization course she had postponed completing. "Sarah, are you in here?" Laura Bennett's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Just reorganizing supplies," Sarah responded, pretending to check boxes of sterile gloves. Laura closed the door behind her, creating a small sanctuary of confidentiality amid the hospital bustle. "We all saw what happened," she said directly. Blackwell crossed a line. "It's not the first time," Sarah replied with a sad smile, "and I'll survive, as always." "This time is different," Laura lowered her voice, though they were alone. "Mr. Harrison has specifically requested that you supervise his care during his entire stay." Sarah looked up, surprised. "The millionaire? Why would he do that? He doesn't even know me. Apparently he was impressed by your, how did he put it, professional integrity in the face of administrative adversity." Laura couldn't help but smile. Blackwell is fuming, but he can't refuse. Harrison's donation for the oncology wing is too important. A tingle of unease ran down Sarah's back. Being the center of attention had never been her goal. She simply wanted to do her job with the excellence her patients deserved. "I'm not sure it's a good idea, Laura. Being Harrison's personal nurse would put me directly in Blackwell's crosshairs." "You're already in his crosshairs, dear. At least this way you'll have some protection." Laura handed her a file. "Here's his medical history. Familiarize yourself with it. They're expecting you in the presidential suite in 20 minutes. When Laura left, Sarah opened the file with professional curiosity. Maxwell Harrison, 62, admitted for acute chest pain, no confirmed heart attack. History of controlled hypertension with medication. non-smoker, social drinker, chronically elevated stress levels according to psychological evaluation. Something about that profile seemed strangely familiar, though she was sure she had never treated the businessman. She continued reading until a name in the emergency contacts section caught her attention. Elizabeth Harrison, deceased. A chill ran through her body. Elizabeth Harrison. That name was etched in her memory, associated with one of the most challenging and rewarding cases of her career. 5 years ago, Sarah had cared for a woman with that name in the intensive care unit after a devastating car accident. The doctors had given a grim prognosis, but Sarah had implemented an innovative care regimen, combining modern techniques with traditional practices learned from her Cherokee grandmother. Against all odds, the patient had improved enough to be transferred to a private clinic for rehabilitation. Sarah never knew what had become of her afterward. Could it be the same person? The businessman's wife? With this question hammering in her mind, Sarah closed the file and headed toward what she sensed would be a turning point in her life. The presidential suite at Mercy Grace Hospital looked more like a luxury hotel room than a clinical space. Sarah paused for a moment at the door, taking a deep breath to calm her nerves. In 20 years of her career, she had treated important personalities, politicians, artists, athletes. But something about Maxwell Harrison intimidated her in a different way. Perhaps it was the way he had intervened in her defense, or maybe the possibility that his wife was that patient who had left such a deep mark on her professional memory. She knocked softly and entered after hearing a firm, "Come in." "Good afternoon, Mr. Harrison. I'm Sarah Winters, the nurse who will be supervising your care during your stay." The businessman observed her from the armchair by the window, where he was reviewing documents on a tablet. His eyes, an intense brown, seemed to evaluate every detail of her presence. "The nurse who prefers humanity to efficiency," he finally responded, with a hint of a smile. "A pleasure to formally meet you." "Thank you for your intervention this morning, although it wasn't necessary," said Sarah, as she approached to check the portable heart monitor. "I'm used to handling Mr. Blackwell's particularities." "I don't doubt your ability to defend yourself, Nurse Winters, but sometimes even the strongest need an unexpected ally." Their gazes met briefly, and something indefinable floated in the air between them. It wasn't attraction. Both had lived long enough to recognize and name that feeling, but a kind of mutual recognition, as if two souls forged by similar experiences silently identified each other. "Your vital signs are stable," Sarah commented, breaking the moment. "Have you experienced any discomfort since the last check?" "None, except the discomfort of being here when I should be in my office." Sarah smiled as she noted the values on the medical tablet. "Boredom is usually a good sign in medical terms, Mr. Harrison. Call me Maxwell, please. If you're going to monitor my bodily functions for the next few days, I think we can dispense with formalities." The request surprised her, but she nodded. "As you prefer, Maxwell." While adjusting the monitor's settings, Sarah gathered the courage to ask the question that had been on her mind. "Excuse my boldness, but I noticed the name Elizabeth Harrison in your file. Was she your wife?" Maxwell's expression changed subtly. A mixture of surprise and melancholy crossed his face. "She was. She passed away 2 years ago." "I'm very sorry," Sarah responded sincerely. "I was wondering was she admitted to this hospital approximately 5 years ago, after a car accident?" Maxwell set the tablet aside, straightening in his seat. "Yes, she was." "How do you know that?" "I was her nurse during her stay in intensive care," Sarah explained, remembering those intense days. "It was a case I never forgot. Her initial recovery was extraordinary." An emotionally charged silence filled the room. Maxwell slowly stood and walked to the window, turning his back to Sarah. "The doctors said she wouldn't survive the first night," he finally spoke, his voice slightly hoarser. "But she did. And then she made it through the second night and the week and the first month. The specialists couldn't explain it." "She had an extraordinary will to live," Sarah commented. "It wasn't just her will." Maxwell turned to look at her. "It was you." Elizabeth talked about a nurse who came even outside her shift, who applied herbal compresses that reduced inflammation when conventional medications failed, who talked to her even though she was unconscious. Sarah felt a lump in her throat. She had never received formal recognition for her unconventional methods. In fact, she had been reprimanded on more than one occasion for implementing traditional medicine practices alongside standard protocols. "I was just doing my job," she responded humbly. "No, you did much more than that. You gave me 2 additional years with the woman I loved." The confession, so direct and emotionally charged, left Sarah speechless. Maxwell returned to his seat, regaining his usual composure. When Elizabeth finally passed away, it wasn't from the accident's aftermath, but from a congenital heart condition we had never detected. A cruel irony. "I'm so sorry," Sarah repeated, this time with a deeper meaning. "Fate has a peculiar sense of humor, don't you think? Here I am, occupying a hospital bed for heart problems, being cared for by the woman who once saved my wife." Maxwell smiled with melancholy. Elizabeth would have appreciated the poetic symmetry. "Was she a poet?" Sarah asked, genuinely interested. "A literature professor. She wrote poetry in secret, just for herself. After her death, I found notebooks filled with verses she never shared with anyone." He paused. "Not even with me." Something in the vulnerability of that confession touched Sarah deeply. This powerful man, feared in business circles from what she had heard, showed a completely different facet when speaking of his lost wife. "Sometimes we keep parts of ourselves as private treasures," Sarah reflected. "Not because we don't trust those we love, but because those intimate spaces define us in ways that even we don't fully understand." Maxwell looked at her with new appreciation. "You speak like someone who also keeps her own private treasures, Nurse Winters." Sarah smiled enigmatically as she completed her notes in the digital file. "My shift ends in an hour. I'll stop by to check your vital signs once more before I leave. Do you need anything in the meantime?" "Yes," Maxwell responded decisively. "I need you to tell me more about those traditional techniques you used with Elizabeth, and I also want to know why a talent like yours continues to endure administrators like Blackwell instead of working at an institution that truly values your skills." The frankness of the request took Sarah by surprise. "Those are long conversations, Mr. Maxwell. And my time is measured according to the new protocols." "Then consider it part of my psychological treatment," he responded with a shrewd smile. "Surely reducing the patient's stress must be within those protocols, isn't it?" For the first time in a long time, Sarah felt she had found someone who understood the contradictions of the system in which she worked. With a mixture of caution and curiosity, she allowed herself to imagine that perhaps, just maybe, this unexpected encounter could be the catalyst for a necessary change in her life. What she couldn't foresee was how deep and transformative that change would be, not only for her but for everyone around her. Sarah's transfer to the geriatric area in early February fell like a bucket of cold water on her. Although Blackwell had presented it as a strategic relocation to leverage her experience with elderly patients, everyone at the hospital knew the truth. It was punishment for having gained Maxwell Harrison's protection during his stay. The geriatric wing, located on the 2nd floor of the old annex building, was considered by many as professional exile within Mercy Grace Hospital. The poorly lit corridors, obsolete equipment and patient overload caused many nurses to request transfers after a few weeks. "I'm sorry, Sarah," Laura had told her the day she received the notification. "I tried to block it, but Blackwell went over my head. He went directly to the board of directors arguing urgent operational needs." But to everyone's surprise, especially Blackwell's, Sarah found in that forgotten corner of the hospital an unexpected garden where her most unique talents could flourish. "Mrs. Robinson, today you're scheduled for a sitz bath with calendula and witch hazel infusion," Sarah announced as she entered room 214, carrying a stainless steel basin covered with a clean towel. The 92-year-old woman, who had been hospitalized for 3 months for a particularly resistant pressure ulcer, smiled, showing her partial dentures. "Nurse Sarah, those baths of yours have done more for my behind than all the expensive ointments they've put on me in years." Sarah laughed as she prepared the treatment. "They're not my baths, Mrs. Robinson. They're remedies that have existed for centuries. My grandmother used them, and her grandmother before her. Well, they should teach those secrets in universities, instead of so many gadgets that don't even work in the end," the elderly woman responded, as Sarah helped her position correctly. In just a month, Sarah had transformed the geriatric wing by implementing a care system that integrated modern medicine with traditional treatments, clay poultices to reduce inflammation, essential oils to stimulate peripheral circulation, therapeutic massage techniques to prevent contractures, and specific teas to complement prescribed medications. The results had been extraordinary. The rate of pressure ulcers had been reduced by 60%, urinary infections had decreased dramatically, and the use of analgesics had dropped by almost a third. Most importantly, the patient's moods had improved notably. "Sarah, Dr. Oliver wants to see you when you finish," informed Megan, a newly graduated nursing assistant who had specifically requested to work with Sarah after hearing about her innovative methods. "Did he mention what for?" asked Sarah, finishing documenting the procedure on the medical tablet. "No, but he seemed interested, not upset," responded the young woman with a conspiratorial smile. After completing Mrs. Robinson's care, Sarah headed to the small office that the head of the geriatrics department shared with two resident physicians. Unlike Blackwell, Dr. James Oliver was an old-school physician, more interested in clinical results than administrative statistics. "Come in, Winters," he greeted her with his characteristic deep voice. "Please sit down." Sarah obeyed, mentally preparing for some kind of reprimand. Despite the good results, her unconventional methods had generated resistance among some of the more traditional medical staff. "I've been reviewing the department's indicators," Dr. Oliver began, adjusting his glasses as he studied a series of graphs on his computer. "And frankly, they're surprising." "In what sense, Doctor?" "In every possible sense." He turned the screen to show her the statistics. Reduction in complications, decrease in hospital stay time, improvement in satisfaction indices. These are the best numbers this unit has had in the last decade. Sarah felt a mixture of pride and relief. "The team has worked very hard, Doctor." "Don't be modest, Winters. We all know this is the result of your, what should we call them, alternative methods." Oliver removed his glasses and looked at her directly. "I want you to tell me about those techniques, in detail." The request took her by surprise. For years, she had maintained a low profile regarding her knowledge of traditional medicine, implementing it discreetly and documenting it under generic terms like complementary care to avoid questioning. "They're simply traditional practices, Doctor. Remedies I've learned over the years, mainly from my grandmother, who was a healer in her Cherokee community." "And do you have any scientific evidence supporting these methods?" Sarah tensed slightly. "The evidence is in the results we're obtaining. Many of these practices have centuries of empirical use, though I recognize that not all have been subjected to formal clinical trials." To her surprise, Oliver smiled. "Winters, I'm not questioning your methods. I'm interested in documenting them properly. I believe we might be onto something important here." "I don't understand." "I'm preparing a proposal for a pilot study on integrating traditional medicine into geriatric care, and I want you to be the coordinator of the nursing component." Sarah blinked, processing what she had just heard. "A formal study, with institutional approval?" "That's right. With protocol reviewed by the ethics committee, standardized documentation, and if preliminary results warrant it, possible publication in specialized journals." Oliver seemed genuinely enthusiastic. "What do you think?" "It's incredible, Doctor. But what about the administration? Mr. Blackwell doesn't seem very supportive of approaches that deviate from established protocols." Oliver's expression hardened slightly. "Let me worry about Blackwell. I have some allies on the board of directors who are more interested in real innovation than efficiency statistics." Sarah felt a spark of hope that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. The possibility of formally validating the knowledge she had treasured and developed over the years, of contributing to a body of knowledge that could benefit more patients. It was a dream she had gradually abandoned under the pressure of institutional realities. "I would very much like to be part of that study, Doctor," she finally responded. "Excellent. We'll prepare the preliminary documentation next week." Oliver paused, as if considering whether to share something more. "By the way, did you know you've acquired a kind of fame among patients? Some are specifically requesting to be transferred to the floor of the healer nurse." Sarah couldn't help but smile. "I hope that doesn't cause additional problems." "On the contrary, it's creating demand, and in today's hospital world, demand is power." Oliver looked at her with curiosity. "A personal question, if I may. Why have you never sought to formalize your knowledge? With your experience, you could have done a doctorate in integrative nursing or something similar. The question touched a sensitive point. Sarah looked toward the window, where the tops of the trees in the small park surrounding the hospital could be seen. Life has ways of leading us down unexpected paths, Doctor. When I was young, I dreamed of studying ethnobotany, but my father fell ill. Then my brother needed special care. Family responsibilities took priority. She paused. And over time, one learns to find ways to do what one loves within the limitations that life imposes. Oliver nodded with understanding. It's never too late to pick up those dreams, Winters. And perhaps this study is the first step in that direction. When she left the office, Sarah felt a strange lightness in her heart. Perhaps the transfer that Blackwell had conceived as punishment was, in reality, the door to a new stage in her professional life. What she didn't know was that, at the same time as she was discovering this new garden of possibilities, the seeds of a storm were beginning to germinate on the upper floors of the hospital. Maxwell Harrison's private office on the 26th floor of Sentinel Tower offered a panoramic view of the city that normally gave him a sense of control and perspective. However, that March afternoon, not even that urban landscape stretching at his feet managed to calm his unease. "The numbers don't lie, Margaret," he finally said, looking away from the screen where his financial director had presented the quarterly projections. "We're backed against a wall." Margaret Chen, a 60-year-old woman with an exceptional analytical mind and the loyalty of someone who had risen alongside her boss from the company's beginnings, nodded gravely. "The Asian consortium continues to delay signing the agreement. Without that capital injection, we'll have to start significant cuts beginning in May." "Cuts means people, Margaret. Families." Maxwell rubbed his temples where the pulsing pain threatened to turn into a migraine. "What about the restructuring proposal that David presented? Your son has good ideas, but they require time we don't have. The reality is that we need an immediate solution or we start dismantling what we've built over 4 decades. Maxwell completed bitterly. "That's not an option." A heavy silence settled in the office. Finally, Margaret spoke with the frankness that only years of mutual trust allowed. "Maxwell, there's another option we haven't openly discussed. Wilson Reed's offer." The businessman's face hardened at hearing that name. Wilson Reed, his former partner, and now his fiercest competitor, had offered to buy Harrison Enterprises at a price considerably below its real value, but enough to settle debts and leave a dignified margin. "I'd rather close the company than sell it to that vulture," he responded dryly. "I know. I just wanted to make sure all options were on the table." Margaret began to gather her documents. "By the way, your doctor called. He says the latest tests show stress levels that continue to be concerning." Maxwell made a dismissive gesture. "I'll be fine. He also mentioned that you've cancelled 2 follow-up appointments in the last month." "I'm busy trying to save 3,500 jobs, Margaret. Medical appointments can wait." The financial director looked at him with the concern of someone who has seen the consequences of executive burnout too many times. "The company needs its leader in top form, Maxwell. And if you'll allow me to speak as a friend and not as your CFO, Elizabeth wouldn't want to see you neglecting your health like this." The mention of his late wife touched a sensitive fiber. Maxwell turned to the window, turning his back to his trusted collaborator, so she wouldn't see how that name still had the power to alter his composure. "I'll call you tonight if there's any news from the consortium," he finally said, ending the conversation. When Margaret left, Maxwell remained motionless in front of the window, watching how the city lights began to turn on as the sunset tinted the sky in reddish hues. His thoughts, however, weren't on the skyscrapers that stood before him, but on a much less imposing building, Mercy Grace Hospital. Almost without realizing it, he took out his phone and looked up a number he had saved a month ago after his medical discharge. He hesitated a moment before pressing call. 3 rings later, a female voice answered. "Hello? Nurse Winters? This is Maxwell Harrison." A brief silence on the other end of the line. "Mr. Harrison, what a surprise. Are you all right?" The genuine concern in her voice made Maxwell smile involuntarily. "Physically, yes. In other aspects, let's say I've had better days." "I understand," Sarah responded, with that tone that combined professionalism and empathy. "Can I help you with something?" Maxwell realized he hadn't really planned what to say. Why had he called a nurse he barely knew in a moment of business crisis? "Actually, I was calling to see how you're doing in your new position in geriatrics, he improvised. I heard Blackwell transferred you after my departure. News travels fast, Sarah commented with a slight note of humor. I'm fine, thank you for asking. It turns out the geriatric wing has been an unexpected opportunity. We're implementing a pilot program that integrates traditional practices with conventional medicine. Sounds interesting. It is. Dr. Oliver has been surprisingly receptive. We're even formally documenting the results for a possible study. The conversation flowed with a naturalness that surprised them both. Maxwell found himself sharing some of his business concerns, while Sarah told him about the challenges of implementing innovations in a system resistant to change. There are days when I wonder if it wouldn't be easier to give up and accept offers to work in the private sector, Sarah confessed. My friend Thomas insists I could earn triple at the clinic where he works. And why don't you? Maxwell asked with genuine curiosity. There was a pause before Sarah answered. Because I believe that real change must happen within the system, not by escaping it. If all professionals committed to more humane care abandon public hospitals, who will defend the patients who can't pay for private care? Those words resonated deeply with Maxwell. He himself faced a similar dilemma: sell the company and secure his personal well-being, or fight to the end to maintain the jobs of thousands of people who depended on his decisions. You have admirable integrity, Nurse Winters, he finally said. Sarah, please. And it's not admiration I need, but allies. Her voice took on a more serious tone. In fact, there's something that concerns me that you might want to know. What is it? I've noticed some irregularities at the hospital lately. Diluted medications, reused material that should be disposable, staff cuts that put patients at risk. Sarah paused. When I tried to report it, I hit a wall of silence. The head nurse, Laura, advised me not to create problems, though I suspect she herself is secretly documenting these situations. The revelation set off alarms in Maxwell's mind. As a potential donor, he had a legitimate interest in the proper management of the hospital. Do you have evidence of these irregularities? Some photographs, inventory records that don't match the material actually available. Nothing conclusive on its own, but enough to establish a pattern. I'd like to see that information, said Maxwell, his business mind already evaluating implications and strategies. Could we meet? The proposal hung in the air for a few moments. There's a cafe near the hospital, the corner of time. It's quiet and discreet. I could meet you there tomorrow at 4, when my shift ends. I'll be there, Maxwell confirmed. When the call ended, he was surprised to notice that his headache had disappeared. For the first time in weeks, he felt his mind focusing on something beyond the business crisis consuming him. As he returned to his desk to review the latest emails from the Asian consortium, Maxwell reflected on the strange bond that seemed to be forming between him and that extraordinary nurse. It wasn't romantic attraction. The memory of Elizabeth remained too present, but a connection based on shared values and parallel challenges. What he couldn't foresee was how that seemingly casual meeting in a cafe would transform not only his personal perspective, but the very fate of the two institutions that defined their lives, Mercy Grace Hospital and Harrison Enterprises. The Corner of Time Cafe occupied the ground floor of a restored Art Deco building 3 blocks from Mercy Grace Hospital. With its brass lamps, shelves filled with antique volumes, and the persistent aroma of freshly ground coffee, the place seemed to exist in a temporal dimension distinct from the frantic city surrounding it. Sarah arrived punctually at 4, still wearing her uniform under her grey coat. She chose a table in the most secluded corner and ordered ginger tea while she waited. Her fingers drummed nervously on the manila folder containing the documentation she had compiled about the hospital irregularities. Am I doing the right thing? She wondered for the umpteenth time. Sharing internal information with someone outside the institution, however much of a benefactor he might be, could be considered a betrayal. But if she didn't act, the patients would be the ones to suffer. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't notice Maxwell's presence until he sat across from her. Sorry for the delay, he apologized. The traffic is impossible. Sarah was surprised to see him dressed relatively informally, dark pants, a blue shirt without a tie, and a grey blazer. Without the formal suit he wore during his hospital stay, he seemed more accessible, though no less imposing. Thank you for coming, she responded, discreetly pushing the folder to the side. Maxwell caught the gesture but made no comment. Instead, he ordered an espresso and observed the place with appreciation. An interesting spot. It doesn't seem to belong to this century. That's why I like it, Sarah smiled. Here, time seems to move at a different pace. A luxury in our profession. The conversation flowed naturally for the first few minutes. Comments about the unusually warm weather for March, anecdotes about peculiar patients, observations about changes in the city, a preliminary social dance before addressing the topics that had really brought them there. Finally, Maxwell directed his gaze toward the folder. "Is that the information you mentioned?" Sarah nodded, sliding the folder toward him. "It all started after my transfer to geriatrics. I began to notice discrepancies between prescribed medications and those administered. Initially, I thought they were isolated errors, but soon I established a pattern." Maxwell opened the folder and meticulously examined its contents. Photographs of medication labels with suspiciously manipulated expiration dates, inventory records with contradictory annotations, copies of purchase orders that didn't match the supplies received. "This is serious," he commented after reviewing everything. "Have you shared this information with anyone else within the hospital?" "With Laura, my supervisor. She warned me to be discreet while gathering more evidence. I think she's building a broader case, but she hasn't shared the details with me." "Prudent," Maxwell nodded. "And do you have any theory about who's behind this?" Sarah lowered her voice, though the ambient music and distance from other tables guaranteed some privacy. "The purchasing department reports directly to administration, and all important administration decisions go through Blackwell. I can't imagine something of this magnitude happening without his knowledge, at least." "Motive? Money, I suppose. The budget cuts have been draconian in the last year. Blackwell receives bonuses for keeping costs below a certain threshold." Maxwell closed the folder, his expression turning grave. "This goes beyond mismanagement, Sarah. If these diluted or reused materials are causing harm to patients, we're talking about criminal negligence." "I know. That's why I came to you." Sarah looked at him directly. "As a potential donor, you have influence. I thought that perhaps you could—" "Pressure the board of directors," Maxwell completed. "It's a possibility, though it would have to be done carefully. Presenting accusations of this type without conclusive evidence could be counterproductive." A reflective silence settled between them as each weighed the implications of intervening in such a delicate situation. "There's something else you should know," Maxwell finally said. "My position isn't as strong as it should be to exert that pressure." "What do you mean?" The businessman hesitated for a moment, but something about Sarah's integrity inspired an unusual trust in him. "Harrison Enterprises is going through serious financial difficulties. The donation I had promised to the hospital, at this moment, I'm not sure I can fulfill it." The confession surprised Sarah. Like many, she had assumed that Maxwell Harrison's fortune was as solid as the buildings that bore his name. "I'm sorry to hear that," she responded sincerely. "Is there any possibility the situation might improve? We're negotiating with a foreign consortium, but the talks are progressing slowly. If we don't get that investment—" He left the sentence unfinished, but his expression completed the thought. Thousands of jobs would be at risk. Sarah perceived the weight carried by this seemingly all-powerful man. Like her, with her patients and her mother, Maxwell felt the responsibility of protecting those who depended on him. "I understand," she said simply. "I'll look for another way to address the situation at the hospital." "I didn't say I can't help," Maxwell clarified. "I just wanted to be transparent about my current position." Their gazes met, and in that instant, something changed between them. They were no longer a businessman and a nurse discussing institutional problems, but two people recognizing their shared humanity, their parallel vulnerabilities. "I have a proposal for you, Sarah," Maxwell said after a moment. "Regardless of what happens with my company, I'm involved in other projects. One of them is a small community clinic that I founded years ago in memory of my mother." Sarah listened attentively, intrigued by this unknown facet of the businessman. "The clinic primarily serves people without resources, with a focus on preventive medicine and comprehensive treatments. The current medical director will retire in July, and we're looking for someone who can lead the nursing department and community programs." "Sounds like a wonderful project," Sarah commented. "It is, and I think you would be perfect for the position." Maxwell paused. The salary would be approximately 3 times what you currently earn at Mercy Grace, with schedule flexibility and resources to implement innovative programs like those you've developed in geriatrics. The offer fell like a bomb in Sarah's mind. It was exactly the type of opportunity she had dreamed of, a space where her traditional knowledge would be valued, not merely tolerated, with the economic stability that would allow her to provide her mother with the care she needed. That's very generous, Maxwell. But why me? Because in 40 years of business, I've learned to recognize exceptional talent, and because I know firsthand the difference your care can make. His voice softened. Elizabeth used to say there are people who not only heal bodies but restore souls. You are one of them. Sarah felt a lump in her throat at the mention of Elizabeth. I need time to think about it, she finally responded. Of course. The position will be available in July, so you have time. Maxwell took a card from his blazer and slid it across the table. My personal number. Call me when you've made a decision, or if anything new arises with the hospital situation. As she put the card in her purse, Sarah was aware that she had reached a crossroads. Maxwell's offer represented an honorable exit from a system that increasingly felt suffocating, an opportunity to practice medicine on her own terms. But leaving Mercy Grace would mean leaving behind vulnerable patients, colleagues who shared her vision, and the possibility of changing the system from within. Would this be a strategic retreat or a disguised surrender? What neither Sarah nor Maxwell could foresee was that forces beyond their control were about to dramatically alter the board on which this delicate game of loyalties, principles, and survival was being played. May arrived with an unusual heat wave and an atmosphere of growing tension in the hallways of Mercy Grace Hospital. Rumors about additional budget cuts circulated among the staff like a resistant virus, while patients began to notice subtle but consistent deterioration in the quality of care. For Sarah, each day had become a balancing act between fulfilling her professional responsibilities, discreetly documenting the irregularities she continued to observe, and dealing with indecision about Maxwell Harrison's offer. That mid-May morning, while making her morning rounds in the geriatric wing, her phone vibrated with a message from Laura. Need to see you urgently. Lunch at the outdoor cafeteria. Not at the hospital one. The final specification set off all the alarms in Sarah's mind. In the 15 years she had been working with Laura, she had never shown such a level of paranoia. At 1:15 p.m., Sarah crossed the small park that separated the main hospital building from the university cafeteria, where many employees preferred to have lunch to briefly escape the clinical environment. She found Laura at a secluded table, under a flowering magnolia tree with 2 salads already served. "You're late," commented the head nurse, though her tone lacked real reproach. Her face, normally serene, showed signs of stress, pronounced dark circles, and visible tension in her jaw. "A last-minute emergency with Mr. Thompson. His catheter got blocked and I had to replace it." Sarah sat down, noting that Laura had chosen the only corner of the terrace where they couldn't be overheard from other tables. "What's going on, Laura? You're scaring me." Laura looked around once more before leaning forward. "They found my file." Sarah felt her stomach flip. The file was what they called the exhaustive documentation that Laura had been compiling for months on the hospital's administrative irregularities. "Who?" "I'm not sure. Someone entered my office last night. The file was in an encrypted folder on my personal computer, but I left a USB drive with a copy in my desk drawer. This morning, it was gone." "Have you reported it to security?" Laura let out a bitter laugh. "To the security department that reports directly to Blackwell? No, thanks. I prefer to keep my job a few more days." "What exactly did that file contain?" asked Sarah, though she suspected the answer. "Everything. Records of diluted medications, reused materials, unpaid overtime, staff cuts that violate minimum safety standards." Laura paused. "And the emails between Blackwell and the Phantom Supplier." "Phantom Supplier?" "Integrated Medical Supplies, a company that appeared out of nowhere 8 months ago and now handles 40% of our disposable material purchases. Their prices are slightly lower than established suppliers, but the quality—" Laura shook her head. "I managed to track the ownership. It's registered under the name of Ryan Blackwell." "Richard's brother?" Sarah almost dropped her fork. "That's a flagrant conflict of interest." "It's fraud, Sarah. Systematic institutional fraud." Laura ran a hand over her face. "And now someone knows that I know. You should go directly to the board of directors." "With what evidence?" "The USB drive disappeared and my original file could easily be questioned. They could accuse me of fabricating evidence." Sarah considered mentioning her own documentation and the meetings with Maxwell Harrison, but something stopped her. If the situation was as serious as it seemed, the fewer people who knew about her external contacts, the better. "What do you plan to do?" "For now, act normally. But I have a plan B." Laura lowered her voice even further. "I've been in contact with some families of patients who have noticed the deterioration in care. Influential people who could exert pressure from outside. That's risky, Laura. More risky is continuing to allow them to endanger our patients." The determination in Laura's eyes reminded Sarah why she admired that woman so much. "There's something else you should know. Blackwell is preparing a departmental reorganization. He plans to dissolve the geriatric unit and distribute patients between internal medicine and rehabilitation. He can't do that. The program is showing exceptional results. Dr. Oliver has even presented the preliminary data to the Medical Society. Precisely why he wants to dismantle it. Your integrative care model requires more staff and more time per patient. It goes against his efficiency at all costs philosophy." Laura took a sip of water. "And between us, I think it's personal. He hasn't forgotten the incident with Harrison." Sarah processed the information, feeling how the pieces fit into a disturbing pattern. Maxwell's offer, which a few weeks ago had seemed premature, now presented itself as a providential lifeline. "The community clinic," she murmured to herself. "What?" "Nothing important." Sarah decided to change the subject. "When would this reorganization be implemented?" "The plan is to present it to the board in early June and implement it gradually during the summer. By September, the geriatric unit as we know it would cease to exist." A knot formed in Sarah's throat. The space she had transformed, the patients who had flourished under the new care model, the young professionals who had begun to request internships in the unit to learn the integrative methods, all would disappear. "We can't allow it," she finally said. Laura studied her with a mixture of affection and concern. "Sarah, you know I love you like a sister, but you need to be realistic. This is a game we can't win, not against Blackwell and whoever is backing him on the board." "Maybe not alone," Sarah responded, an idea forming in her mind. "But what if we had unexpected allies?" Before Laura could ask what she meant, Sarah's phone vibrated with an incoming call. The name on the screen surprised her, Maxwell Harrison. "I need to take this," she apologized, rising from the table and moving a few steps away. "Maxwell, is something wrong?" The voice on the other end sounded tense, very different from his usual tone. "Sarah, I'm sorry to bother you during your workday. There's something you need to know and I'd prefer you hear it from me before it's in the news." "What is it?" "Harrison Enterprises is officially in financial crisis. The negotiations with the Asian consortium failed, and tomorrow we'll announce a restructuring that will include the closure of 3 divisions. Sarah felt a pang of empathy for the families who would be affected. "I'm so sorry, Maxwell. I know how hard you fought to avoid this." "There's more," he continued, his voice now lower. "The offer I made you about the nursing directorship at the community clinic. It still stands, but I need to be honest with you. The Foundation's financial situation is also compromised. I can't guarantee that the salary will be what we discussed initially, at least not in the short term." The revelation should have been devastating, but strangely, Sarah felt a kind of relief. The decision she had been postponing was clarified by this new reality. "I appreciate your honesty, Maxwell. And I want you to know that my interest in the project was never primarily economic." "You're an extraordinary woman, Sarah Winters," he responded with a note of genuine admiration. "The Foundation will have an emergency meeting next week to reevaluate priorities. Could you attend? Your perspective would be invaluable." "Of course." When she ended the call and returned to the table, Laura observed her with curiosity. "Good news?" "Not exactly," Sarah responded. "But sometimes crises force us to see solutions that were always there." As they returned to the hospital, Sarah felt a strange calm, like the one that precedes great storms. The revelations of that day, the institutionalized corruption at Mercy Grace, the plans to dismantle her unit, the financial crisis at Harrison Enterprises, should have plunged her into despair. Instead, She felt that all the pieces were beginning to align toward a greater revelation, one that would transform not only her professional path, but the very fate of the institutions that had defined her life until then. What she couldn't imagine was that the catalyst for this transformation would come from the most unexpected source. Amy Patterson, Richard Blackwell's discreet personal assistant, who at that precise moment was copying confidential documents onto a USB drive, driven by a combination of moral indignation and professional ambition that would forever alter the balance of power at Mercy Grace Hospital. The first week of June brought with it suffocating heat and the outbreak of the crisis that had been brewing for months. It all began with an anonymous email sent to 12 influential families whose loved ones were regular patients at Mercy Grace Hospital. The message, concise and devastating, included detailed documentation on the questionable practices implemented by the administration, diluted medications, reused material, staff cuts that compromised patient safety. By Wednesday, the story had reached local media. By Friday, it was a national scandal. "It's a media circus out there," exclaimed Megan, rushing into the staff break room where Sarah was having a quick coffee between rounds. "There are 3 television channels at the main entrance, and they say the Patient Association is organizing a protest for tomorrow." Sarah nodded, maintaining an outer calm that contrasted with her inner turbulence. She knew Laura had been in contact with patients' families, but the magnitude and speed with which the situation had escalated exceeded any expectation. "Any official reaction from the administration?" she asked. "Blackwell called a press conference for this afternoon. They say he's going to announce a thorough and independent investigation." Megan made a skeptical gesture, as if anyone would believe him at this point. Sarah's phone vibrated in her uniform pocket. A message from Laura. "My office now." "I have to go," she apologized, leaving the half-full cup on the table. She found Laura in her small office, accompanied by a young woman whom Sarah vaguely recognized as part of the administrative staff. "Close the door," Laura indicated, her expression more serious than Sarah had ever seen. "Sarah, this is Amy Patterson, Mr. Blackwell's personal assistant, and the anonymous source behind the leak." Sarah looked with surprise at the young woman, who appeared no more than 30, and maintained a perfectly upright posture, despite the evident tension in her face. "Mrs. Winters," greeted Amy with formality. "I followed your work in the geriatric unit. It's inspiring." "Amy came to me 3 days ago," explained Laura. "It was she who took my USB drive, not to expose me, but to complement the documentation she herself had been compiling." "Why?" Sarah asked the young woman directly. "You work directly for Blackwell. Why risk everything like this?" Amy maintained her composure, though her slightly trembling hands betrayed her nervousness. "I studied hospital administration with a specialization in healthcare ethics. When I began working for Mr. Blackwell 2 years ago, I believed in his vision of modernizing the hospital, but I soon discovered that modernization was a euphemism for cuts that primarily benefited his annual bonuses." She paused, as if weighing how much to reveal. "The breaking point was when I discovered the connection with integrated medical supplies. It's not only owned by his brother, but there's evidence of systematic overcharging. The hospital pays for first-quality materials and receives suboptimal products. Well, it's not hard to imagine where it ends up." "Misappropriation of public funds," murmured Sarah, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Exactly. And when I learned they planned to dismantle the geriatric unit, the only department that was showing exceptional results despite the cuts, I knew I had to act." Amy looked directly at Sarah. "Your integrative care model represents exactly the kind of innovation our healthcare system needs. Destroying it for purely economic reasons, or worse, due to a personal vendetta, was unacceptable." Laura intervened, her voice low but intense. "Amy took an enormous risk. If Blackwell discovers it was she who leaked the information—" "He won't," responded the young woman with surprising confidence. "I took exhaustive precautions. Besides, at this moment he's too busy trying to save his career to investigate his own assistant." "What will happen now?" asked Sarah. "The board of directors has called an emergency meeting for tomorrow," informed Amy. "Blackwell will try to present himself as a victim of circumstances, claiming ignorance of the questionable practices. But I have evidence that he was directly involved in all the decisions." "And do you plan to present that evidence at the meeting?" Sarah couldn't hide her skepticism. The board has always backed Blackwell. The situation has changed, intervened Laura. 3 board members have family members who have been patients affected by the cuts. The media pressure is intense, and besides, a knock on the door interrupted the conversation. Doctor. Oliver poked his head in, his usually calm expression now altered by urgency. Excuse the interruption, but I thought you should know immediately. Maxwell Harrison has just arrived at the hospital. He's demanding a meeting with Blackwell and the board of directors, threatening to withdraw not only his pending donation, but to initiate legal action as a patient affected by negligent practices. The news fell like a bomb in the small office. Sarah felt a mixture of surprise and something close to pride. Despite his own financial crisis, Maxwell had decided to use what influence he had left to fight for the hospital's integrity. There's more, continued Oliver, lowering his voice though they were alone. Harrison didn't come alone. He's accompanied by Catherine Blackwell. Richard's ex-wife? Laura almost choked with surprise. The very same. And according to hallway rumors, she brings documentation on financial irregularities dating back 5 years, to when she still worked in the regional health comptroller's office. A silence laden with implications filled the room. The presence of Catherine Blackwell, known for her relentless integrity and bitter divorce from the administrator, added a personal and potentially devastating dimension to the scandal. This is no longer a storm, murmured Laura. It's a Category 5 hurricane. Sarah rapidly processed the implications. If Maxwell was getting so directly involved, it meant he had decided to bet what remained of his social capital on this battle. It was a brave but desperate gesture, considering the precarious situation of his companies. I need to talk to him, Sarah decided, standing up. Now. With Harrison? Laura seemed confused. Why? Because I think I have a solution that could benefit everyone, Sarah responded enigmatically. Or at least, all those who deserve to be benefited. As she headed toward the boardroom where the confrontation was presumably taking place, Sarah felt that the scattered pieces of a complex puzzle were beginning to fit together in her mind. The hospital crisis, Harrison Enterprises' financial situation, the integrative care model she had developed, Maxwell's community clinic. Everything seemed to converge toward a possibility that until recently would have seemed unthinkable. Turning the corner of the hallway leading to administration, Sarah nearly collided with Maxwell, who was exiting an office with a stormy expression. "Maxwell!" she exclaimed, surprised by the fortuitous encounter. "Sarah!" The businessman seemed equally surprised, but his expression softened slightly. "I suppose you're already aware of the chaos that has been unleashed. I'm barely processing the magnitude of it all," she admitted. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" "In private." Maxwell nodded, guiding her to a small, empty meeting room. Once inside, he closed the door and leaned against it, suddenly exhausted. "This situation is worse than we imagined," he said without preamble. "Catherine has discovered that Blackwell is not only diverting current funds, but has been manipulating the hospital's accounts for years. Several modernization projects that were supposedly completed never existed." "My God," murmured Sarah. "What will happen now?" "The board is in panic. They've temporarily suspended Blackwell and named an interim administrator while a formal investigation develops." Maxwell paused, studying Sarah's face. "But I don't think you wanted to talk to me to discuss Blackwell's fall." "No," she confirmed. "I wanted to talk to you about an idea that's been forming in my mind. One that could represent a solution for both the hospital and for you." "I'm listening." "The geriatric unit we've developed is showing exceptional results with a care model that integrates traditional and modern medicine. Dr. Oliver has documented significant reductions in hospitalization times, fewer complications, less use of expensive medications. I know, I've seen the preliminary reports. It's impressive. What we need is scale and formal scientific validation," continued Sarah, her voice gaining intensity as she articulated a vision that had been subconsciously gestating for weeks. "Imagine a specialized center in integrative medicine, affiliated with the hospital, but with operational autonomy. A place where we can expand this model, conduct formal research, train new professionals." "An institute," murmured Maxwell, immediately catching the vision. "The Mercy Grace Institute for Integrative Medicine." "Exactly. And this is where you come in." Sarah took a breath, aware that she was about to propose something bold. Instead of a simple donation to the hospital, you could invest in creating this institute as a joint venture between Harrison Enterprises and Mercy Grace Hospital, a project that will not only save lives, but could be economically viable in the medium term. Maxwell looked at her with an intensity that indicated he was rapidly calculating implications and possibilities. Integrative therapies are gaining legitimacy and demand, he continued, following the line of thought. With scientifically documented results, we could attract private patients who would subsidize care for people without resources. And we could integrate the community clinic you mentioned, expanding its impact, added Sarah. It would be a pioneering model of public-private collaboration in the health sector. It's ambitious, commented Maxwell, but Sarah noticed the gleam in his eyes, indicating the idea had captured his imagination. Very ambitious considering my company's current situation. Sometimes great innovations arise from the deepest crises, responded Sarah. My grandmother used to say that when everything seems lost, it's because we're looking from the wrong angle. A genuine smile illuminated Maxwell's face for the first time that day. Your grandmother seems to have been a wise woman. I would have liked to meet her. She would have liked you, Sarah responded sincerely. She valued people who used their power to protect the vulnerable. Their gazes met, and in that instant both felt the deep connection that had been developing between them. Not a romantic bond, but something equally powerful, an alliance based on shared values and a common vision of the world they wished to build. We would need to present a solid business plan to the board, Maxwell reflected, his mind already working on the practical aspects. And find additional investors to complement what I can currently contribute. Dr. Oliver has connections with international foundations interested in integrative medicine, and Laura knows several philanthropists who have expressed interest in our pilot program. It could work, murmured Maxwell, more to himself than to Sarah. Then, with renewed determination, he added, No, it will work. I'll personally make sure of it. At that moment, a knock on the door interrupted their conversation. It was Amy Patterson, her usual composure slightly altered. Excuse the interruption, but I thought you should know immediately. The board of directors is requesting both your presence in the main boardroom. Apparently, Dr. Bennett has proposed a complete restructuring of the hospital, with the geriatric unit as the central model for a new philosophy of care. Sarah and Maxwell exchanged looks of surprise and renewed hope. The storm they had feared might be transforming into the wind that would drive a long-needed change. Tell them we'll be there in 5 minutes, Maxwell responded. We have a proposal to present. The boardroom at Mercy Grace Hospital, with its imposing mahogany table and portraits of former directors aligned on the walls, had never witnessed a meeting as tense and potentially transformative as the one taking place on that sweltering June day. Sarah, seated next to Maxwell at one end of the table, observed the faces of the 12 members of the board of directors as Laura Bennett concluded her presentation on the documented administrative irregularities and the restructuring proposal. What we propose is not simply a change in leadership, but a fundamental transformation in our philosophy of care, emphasized Laura, her voice firm despite the pressure. The results of the pilot program in the geriatric unit demonstrate that a patient-centered approach, integrating the best of modern medicine with validated traditional practices, not only improves clinical outcomes, but optimizes resources in the medium term. Dr. William Chambers, chairman of the board of directors and renowned cardiologist, thoughtfully removed his glasses. Your presentation is convincing, Dr. Bennett, and the data is disturbing to say the least. He directed a severe look toward the empty seat normally occupied by Richard Blackwell, absent after his temporary suspension. However, implementing a change of the magnitude you propose would require resources that, frankly, the hospital does not possess at this moment, especially considering that we will need to allocate significant funds to remedy the damage caused by the irregular practices discovered. It was then that Maxwell leaned forward with the confident posture of someone who has navigated countless complex negotiations. If I may intervene, he began, immediately capturing the attention of all present, I believe we can present a solution that simultaneously addresses the current crisis and establishes a solid foundation for the hospital's future. Over the next 15 minutes, Maxwell and Sarah alternately presented their vision of the Institute for Integrative Medicine, a specialized center that would operate as an entity affiliated with the hospital, but with operational and financial autonomy. Maxwell provided the economic analysis and proposed organizational structure, while Sarah detailed the clinical model and expected results based on the geriatric unit's experience. "What we propose," concluded Maxwell, "is a strategic alliance between Harrison Enterprises and Mercy Grace Hospital. My company will provide the initial investment for the institute's infrastructure, while the hospital will contribute the human capital and institutional backing." "It sounds promising," commented Dr. Jennifer Roberts, representative of the Healthcare Workers Union on the board. "But with all due respect, Mr. Harrison, the rumors about your company's financial situation are not exactly reassuring. How can we be sure that you will be able to fulfill the financial commitments of this project?" The question, direct and potentially devastating, would have destabilized many. However, Maxwell maintained his composure, though Sarah noticed the momentary tension in his jaw. "A valid observation, Dr. Roberts," he acknowledged. "It's true that Harrison Enterprises is facing significant challenges currently. However, I have restructured my personal investment portfolio to guarantee this project's viability, regardless of the fate of my other companies." He made a strategic pause before adding, "Furthermore, I would not be alone in this endeavor. I have held preliminary conversations with the International Foundation for Integrative Medicine, which has expressed interest in co-financing the institute, pending approval from this board." This revelation caused a murmur of surprise among those present. The AFIM, as it was known in medical circles, was one of the most prestigious organizations in the field of scientifically validated alternative medicine. Dr. Oliver, who until then had remained silent, cleared his throat. "I can confirm IFIM's interest," he intervened. "I have been in contact with their regional director after sharing the preliminary results of our pilot program. They are impressed, especially with the methodologies developed by Nurse Winters." All eyes turned to Sarah, who maintained a serene expression despite the intensity of the scrutiny. "Mrs. Winters," Dr. Chambers spoke directly, "you have been at the center of this storm, to call it something. First, the incident with Mr. Harrison during his hospitalization, then the development of an innovative program that has generated exceptional results despite operating in the most neglected department of the hospital, and now this revolutionary proposal." He paused, studying her intensely. "What really motivates you?" The question, unexpected and deeply personal, created an expectant silence in the room. Sarah took a moment to organize her thoughts, aware that her response could be decisive for the project's future. "What motivates me, Dr. Chambers, is the same thing that motivated my grandmother when she was a healer in her community, and the same thing that should motivate any healthcare professional: alleviating human suffering using all available knowledge and resources." Her voice, normally soft, acquired an intensity that captured everyone's attention. "For 20 years I have observed how our healthcare system gradually moves away from its fundamental purpose. We have allowed financial considerations and efficiency metrics to replace what should be our moral compass: patient well-being." She paused, looking directly into Dr. Chambers' eyes. "What I propose is not revolutionary, Doctor. It's a return to our roots. A reminder that medicine is not simply a transaction of services, but an act of human connection grounded in scientific knowledge and wisdom accumulated through generations." The room remained silent for a few moments after her words. Finally, Dr. Chambers nodded slowly. "We will proceed to vote on the proposal," he announced. "But first, there is an additional matter we must address." With a gesture, he indicated to his assistant to distribute folders among the board members. Sarah noticed that Maxwell received one as well, though she did not. "During our investigation of the administrative irregularities," continued Dr. Chambers, "we discovered a historical document of considerable relevance to this discussion. As the board members reviewed the contents of the folders, their expressions varied from surprise to incredulity. This document, dated 1973, is the will of Elizabeth Morgan, original founder of Mercy Grace Hospital," explained Dr. Chambers. "It contains a specific clause establishing that any direct descendant of the Morgan family would have the right to a permanent seat on the hospital's board of directors." He paused, looking directly at Sarah. "Mrs. Winters, were you aware that your maternal grandmother, Helen Morgan, was the granddaughter of Elizabeth?" The revelation fell like lightning on Sarah. While she knew her grandmother had been born in the region, she had never mentioned any connection to the hospital's founding family. "No," she responded honestly, trying to process this unexpected information. "My grandmother rarely spoke of her family origins. She always said that her true lineage was the knowledge she had inherited from her ancestors." "Well, it turns out that your lineage includes both ancestral knowledge and legal rights over this institution," commented Dr. Chambers with a slight smile. "Rights that were apparently overlooked during the hospital's restructuring in the 1980s. The euphemism wasn't lost on anyone. The restructuring had actually been a political maneuver to transfer control of the hospital from the founding family to a consortium of local doctors and politicians. This changes the nature of our discussion," intervened Dr. Roberts. "If Mrs. Winters has a legal right to a seat on this board, her proposal acquires significant institutional weight." Maxwell observed the development of events with a mixture of surprise and admiration. He leaned discreetly toward Sarah. "Did you have any idea about this?" he whispered. "None," she responded, still processing the revelation. "My grandmother died when I was 16. She never mentioned being a descendant of the hospital's founder." "Fate has a peculiar sense of humor," murmured Maxwell, repeating the words he had used months earlier during his hospitalization. The meeting continued for almost 2 more hours, discussing legal, financial, and operational aspects of the proposed institute. When the time for the vote finally came, the result was overwhelming. 10 votes in favor, 2 abstentions, none against. "The Mercy Grace Institute for Integrative Medicine is approved in principle," announced Dr. Chambers. "A special committee will be formed to finalize the operational details, led by Dr. Oliver, with the participation of Dr. Bennett, Mrs. Winters, and Mr. Harrison." As the board members began to disperse, Sarah remained seated, overwhelmed by the day's events. Not only had she secured approval for a project that could transform healthcare in the region, but she had discovered an unexpected connection to the institution that had been her professional home for 2 decades. "Are you okay?" asked Maxwell, noticing her thoughtful expression. "I'm processing," she responded with a faint smile. "It's a lot to assimilate in one day." "I understand perfectly. I myself am trying to reconcile how a day that began with the possible liquidation of my company has ended with the birth of a project that could redefine my legacy." They left the boardroom together, walking slowly through the hospital corridors that now seemed different in light of all that had occurred. "What do you think your grandmother would say about all this?" Maxwell asked as they waited for the elevator. Sarah reflected for a moment before responding. "She would probably say that seeds planted with pure intention eventually bloom, even in the most unlikely terrain." She smiled at the memory. "And then she would scold me for being surprised, telling me she always knew my path would bring me back to the origin." "A wise woman," commented Maxwell. "It seems you've inherited more from her than you imagined." As the elevator descended, both silently contemplated the intertwined paths that had led them to this point. What had begun as a chance encounter during a crisis had transformed into an alliance that promised to change not only their lives, but those of countless patients and healthcare professionals. What neither of them could foresee was that the real challenge was just beginning, because transforming an entrenched system would require more than good intentions and financial resources. It would demand a strength of spirit that would test their deepest convictions. The old Eastern Pavilion of Mercy Grace Hospital, abandoned for years after the construction of the new main building, was gradually coming to life under the radiant September sun. Scaffolding surrounded the 3-story structure, while workers came and went carrying construction materials. A provisional sign announced, "Future home of the Mercy Grace Institute for Integrative Medicine. Opening Spring 2026. Sarah contemplated the works from a bench in the small adjacent garden, where years ago recovering patients used to sunbathe. She had been sitting there for an hour, observing the constant movement of workers and technicians, finding in that physical transformation a reflection of the changes occurring in her own life. "I thought I'd find you here," Laura's voice interrupted her thoughts. The head nurse, recently appointed director of care services at the hospital after the restructuring, sat beside her. "Contemplating your future kingdom?" Sarah smiled at the joke. "I can hardly believe it's really happening." "Well, believe it. The final plans are approved, the financing secured, and the selection committee has begun interviewing specialized staff. Laura handed her a folder. The first draft of the procedures manual for the Institute. Oliver and I have incorporated your suggestions on integrating traditional practices. Sarah leafed through the document, noting with satisfaction how her methodologies, initially developed intuitively, were now being formalized into structured protocols. It's strange to see something so organic converted into standardized procedures, she commented. It's the price of institutional legitimization, Laura responded pragmatically. For your methods to propagate beyond your personal influence, they need this translation into bureaucratic language. Both remained silent for a moment, contemplating the building under renovation. Have you decided yet if you'll accept the Institute's directorship? Laura finally asked. The question touched a sensitive point. Since the project's approval 3 months ago, Sarah had been the natural candidate to lead it. However, she had significant reservations. I'm not sure I'm the right person, Laura. I'm a nurse, not an administrator. My place is with the patients, not behind a desk signing documents and attending endless meetings. No one says you have to completely abandon direct care, Laura argued. You could establish a model where the director regularly participates in clinical activities. In fact, it would be consistent with the Institute's philosophy. Sarah sighed, aware that the internal debate she was having went beyond practical considerations. You know what really worries me? That in becoming institutionalized, all this will lose its essence. She made a gesture encompassing the building under renovation. What worked in the geriatric unit arose from a genuine connection with each patient, from the freedom to adapt protocols according to individual needs. I fear that by expanding and formalizing it, we'll end up with a diluted version that meets bureaucratic requirements but loses the soul of care. Laura nodded understandingly. It's a real risk. But there's also the opposite risk, that without your leadership the project will drift toward a conventional model with some alternative elements as decoration instead of true integration. A message on Sarah's phone interrupted the conversation. It was from Maxwell. Important news about IFEM. Can we meet this afternoon? Problems? Asked Laura, noticing the change in her friend's expression. I don't know. Maxwell wants to meet to discuss something about the International Foundation. Sarah put away her phone, thoughtful. His business situation is still complicated. I hope there aren't complications with the funding. Since the Institute's approval, Maxwell had dedicated surprising energy to the project, despite the crisis his other companies were facing. He had personally renegotiated the agreement with the IFIM, contributed part of his personal assets as a guarantee for the initial loans, and even hired a team of architects specialized in therapeutic spaces. That man is investing much more than money in this project, commented Laura with an inquisitive look. Is there something I should know about you two? Sarah shook her head, although an involuntary smile appeared on her lips. We're colleagues, Laura, united by a common goal. Responded Laura, clearly skeptical. A common goal that has led you to spend countless hours together over the last 3 months, sharing meals, late-night phone calls, and that strange non-verbal communication you've developed during meetings. It's complicated, Sarah finally admitted. We're both focused on the Institute, and we both carry personal histories that make it difficult to consider any other type of relationship at this time. Time will tell, responded Laura, standing up. Meanwhile, I need your decision about the directorship before Friday. The board wants to announce the complete leadership team at the official project presentation. When Laura left, Sarah remained a while longer contemplating the building. Her mind wandered between immediate responsibilities, the decision about accepting the directorship, the pending meeting with Maxwell, and deeper reflections on the meaning of everything that had happened in recent months. Would her grandmother, descendant of the hospital's founder, have imagined that her granddaughter would one day be in a position to transform the institution from within? Was this the purpose that had silently guided her path all these years? Hours later, Sarah found herself in the temporary office Maxwell had established in a building near the hospital to coordinate the Institute project. Unlike his imposing corporate office, this space was functional and stripped of ostentation. A simple desk, shelves with project documentation, and a meeting area with a round table and comfortable chairs. Thank you for coming on such short notice, Maxwell greeted her, offering a cup of herbal tea that Sarah noted with surprise was a blend similar to what she herself prepared. "Your message sounded urgent," she responded, accepting the cup and sitting at the round table where several documents were displayed. "It is, though not in the way you probably imagined." Maxwell took a seat across from her, his expression serious, but with a gleam of enthusiasm in his eyes that Sarah had learned to recognize. "I received the final proposal from the IFIM this morning. They're willing to triple their initial contribution." "Triple? That's extraordinary." "Why?" "Because of you," he responded directly. "Or more specifically, because of your methodology. The Foundation's scientific committee reviewed the documented results in the geriatric unit and were impressed, especially with the integration of traditional herbal practices and care techniques that have been shown to reduce dependence on analgesics and accelerate recoveries." Sarah processed the information, surprised by the magnitude of the recognition. "There's a condition, of course," continued Maxwell, sliding a document toward her. "They want the Institute to become an international training center for healthcare professionals interested in integrative medicine. You would personally supervise the development of the curriculum and teaching methodology. That's much more ambitious than we initially contemplated," commented Sarah, quickly reviewing the document. "It is. And it would completely transform the project's scope." Maxwell leaned back in his chair, studying her reaction. "Instead of a local center for care and research, we would be establishing an institution with global projection, a place where your methods could multiply through generations of professionals." The idea was as overwhelming as it was seductive. Sarah had imagined that her legacy would be limited to the patients she personally attended, and perhaps some colleagues who adopted her techniques. The possibility of influencing the training of professionals from various countries would expand that impact exponentially. "I don't know if I'm prepared for something of that magnitude, Maxwell," she confessed. "I'm barely considering whether to accept the directorship of the Institute as we originally conceived it." "I know, and that's why I wanted to discuss it with you before responding to the Foundation." Maxwell looked at her with a mixture of seriousness and affection. "Sarah, I've spent the last 30 years building buildings and companies. Some projects succeeded, others failed, but never until now had I had the opportunity to contribute to something that could transform lives in such a profound way." He leaned forward, his voice acquiring an unusual intensity. "What you've developed deserves to be shared with the world, not only for the sake of potential patients, but because it represents a reconciliation between knowledge systems that our modern medicine has artificially kept separate for too long." His words touched something deep in Sarah. It was true. What she had intuitively developed, combining her grandmother's teachings with her professional training, represented a bridge between worlds that many considered incompatible. "What if I fail?" she finally asked, verbalizing her deepest fear. "What if all this becomes just another bureaucratic institution that loses its connection with real patients?" Maxwell smiled understandingly. "It's a risk. But knowing you as I do now, I believe it's a lesser risk than not trying." He paused before adding, "When Elizabeth passed away, I found among her belongings a notebook where she wrote reflections during her rehabilitation. She mentioned a nurse, now I know it was you, who had introduced practices that doctors considered folkloric, but that provided her relief when nothing else worked." He took out a small notebook with a worn blue cover from a drawer and opened it to a marked page. She wrote, "True medicine doesn't reside in sophisticated equipment or cutting-edge medications, but in hands that know when to hold and when to let go, in eyes that see beyond the symptom to the soul that suffers, and in the wisdom accumulated by generations who have observed nature with humility and respect." Sarah felt a lump in her throat hearing words that could have been spoken by her own grandmother. "Elizabeth understood the essence of what you were trying to do," continued Maxwell, "and I believe that understanding deserves to be propagated, not only to honor her memory or your grandmother's tradition, but because it represents a more human and complete way of healing." A reflective silence settled between them as Sarah weighed everything she had heard. Finally, she made a decision. "I'll accept the Institute's directorship," she said, with renewed determination. "And I'll work with the IFIM on the international training program, but with one condition." "Which is?" "That we continue to consider this project as a collaboration, not as my personal project. I need your business vision, and your pragmatism to balance my idealism. I need Laura and her institutional knowledge, Oliver and his scientific rigor. An interdisciplinary team, Maxwell nodded. Reflecting in the organizational structure, the same integrative philosophy will apply in care. Exactly, Sarah smiled, feeling that a new clarity was emerging from the conversation. And one more condition. I want to continue treating patients regularly, regardless of my administrative responsibilities. The day I lose direct contact with those who come seeking relief, I will have betrayed the fundamental purpose of all this. It seems perfectly reasonable to me, Maxwell agreed. In fact, I think all the Institute's directors should maintain some level of clinical practice. It will keep us honest and connected to the reality we're trying to transform. As they discussed the practical details of the expanded proposal, Sarah felt she had finally found the balance she had been seeking. A path that honored ancestral traditions while embracing the possibilities of modern medicine. An opportunity to lead without abandoning direct service, and a structure that balanced idealism and practicality. What had begun as a crisis, the public humiliation, the punitive transfer, the administrative irregularities, had transformed into the catalyst for profound transformation, not only for the hospital and for herself, but potentially for countless professionals and patients around the world. And at the center of this transformation, almost imperceptible but fundamental, beat something that transcended organizational structures and clinical methodologies. A renewed faith in the human capacity to heal and be healed, to transmit knowledge through generations, and to find meaning in the act of caring for others in their moments of greatest vulnerability. It was, Sarah reflected, as she watched Maxwell enthusiastically explain the details of the training program, the same heart that had beaten in her grandmother's hands as she prepared healing infusions, and in those of countless healers through the centuries, the deep recognition of our fundamental interdependence and of the inherent dignity of each human being. On the eve of the official presentation of the Institute for Integrative Medicine, Sarah was in the apartment she shared with her mother, organizing documents for the next day's ceremony. Eleanor, notably more agile after months of specialized treatment for her arthritis, was preparing tea in the kitchen. "You seem nervous, honey," the older woman commented, placing 2 steaming cups on the dining table, now converted into an improvised office. "I haven't seen you like this since your graduation." Sarah smiled, grateful for the infusion. "Tomorrow is important, Mum. All the work of these months will officially materialize." "And you'll be presented as the director," added Eleanor, with evident pride. "Your grandmother would be so happy to see you honoring her legacy this way." The mention of her grandmother, now charged with the knowledge of her connection to the hospital's foundation, provoked a wave of complex emotions in Sarah. Do you think she knew about her relationship with the hospital's founding family? Eleanor seemed to consider the question carefully. "My mother was a woman of many silences," she finally responded. "She never spoke of the Morgans, though she occasionally mentioned that her grandmother had been an influential woman in the region. I think she preferred to be recognized for her knowledge and her ability to heal, not for a surname or an institutional legacy. Like you," she added after a moment, looking at her daughter with affection. "You've always preferred to let your work speak for you, not your titles or connections." Sarah nodded, recognizing the similarity. "I wonder if I did the right thing, accepting this position. Part of me still believes I could do more good staying in the trenches, attending to patients directly." "And you will continue to do so, from what you've told me," Eleanor responded pragmatically. "But now you'll also be able to train others to follow in your footsteps. As my mother used to say, a single healer can serve a village, but if she teaches her knowledge, she can heal an entire nation." Sarah's phone interrupted the conversation. Maxwell's name appeared on the screen. "Excuse me, Mom. I need to take this." "Of course. Your millionaire partner can't wait," Eleanor responded with a mischievous smile that made Sarah roll her eyes as she stood to take the call in private. "Maxwell, is everything okay with the preparations?" The voice on the other end sounded tense, very different from his usual tone. "Sarah, I need to see you. Something complicated has come up." "What's happening?" "I'd prefer to discuss it in person. Could we meet at the corner of time in half an hour?" The seriousness in his voice was unusual. "Of course. I'll be there." When she hung up, Sarah felt a growing apprehension. Over the past few months, she had learned to recognize the nuances in Maxwell's voice. This particular tone indicated serious problems. "Bad news?" asked Eleanor when Sarah returned to the room. "I don't know. Maxwell wants to see me right now, says it's important." "Go," Eleanor responded with an understanding gesture. "I'll put these documents away. You've worked enough for today." Half an hour later, Sarah entered the corner of time, the cafe that had become a significant place for her and Maxwell. She found him at the same corner table where they had shared so many decisive conversations over the past months. This time, however, the businessman didn't show his usual composure. His eyes reflected concern, and his posture, normally upright, seemed burdened by an invisible weight. "Thanks for coming," he said when Sarah sat across from him. An untouched coffee was cooling between his hands. "You worried me with that call. What's happening?" Maxwell slid an envelope toward her. "I received this 2 hours ago. It's a buyout offer for all my companies, including my participation in the Institute." Sarah opened the envelope and quickly reviewed its contents. The figure mentioned was astronomical. "It's a considerable sum," she commented, trying to decipher Maxwell's expression. "More than considerable. It's an offer that in strictly financial terms would be insane to reject." He paused. "Especially considering that Harrison Enterprises remains in a precarious situation despite recent restructurings." "Who's behind the offer?" "An international consortium led by Wilson Reed." The name provoked a tense silence. Sarah had heard about Maxwell's former partner and now rival during their numerous conversations. "Your enemy," she said simply. "My nemesis, rather," Maxwell corrected with a bitter smile. "The man who has tried to destroy me professionally for a decade and who now, ironically, could be my financial savior." "What would this mean for the Institute?" Maxwell took a breath before responding. "The consortium would maintain the financial commitment for the first year. After that, they would reevaluate their participation based on profitability indicators." The implication was clear. The aspects of the Institute that didn't generate direct economic benefits, precisely those that made it unique and valuable, would be at risk. "But there's an alternative," continued Maxwell. "Reed has personally offered me a special clause. If I agree to join his corporation as Director of Strategic Projects in Asia, he would guarantee complete funding for the Institute according to our original plan for 5 years. In Asia, Sarah processed the implications. That would mean that I would have to relocate to Singapore indefinitely, Maxwell completed, and abandon my active participation in the Institute. The revelation fell like a slab between them. For months they had worked side by side, building not only a professional project, but also a personal relationship that, though never explicitly defined, had become a fundamental pillar for both. "It's an offer designed to separate me from everything I currently value," continued Maxwell, his gaze fixed on the window. "Reed has always been astute at identifying his opponent's vulnerable points. Why are you telling me this now, the night before the official presentation?" "Because I must give an answer before noon tomorrow, and because I couldn't make this decision without consulting you." Their gazes met, loaded with unspoken words. "The Institute will survive without my direct participation, Sarah. The financial backing is assured, and you are the true heart of the project." "But—" He paused as if the following words required special effort. "I'm not sure if I will survive being far from what we've built together." The confession, as close to a personal declaration as Maxwell had ever allowed himself, created a silence charged with emotions. "What do you want to do?" Sarah finally asked. "For the first time in my life, I'm not making a decision based solely on financial or strategic analysis." Maxwell looked at her directly. "What I want is to continue the path we've started together, but I also have a responsibility to my employees, to the families who depend on the companies I've built." Sarah perfectly understood the dilemma. She herself had faced similar conflicts between vocation and responsibility throughout her career. "What if there were a third option?" she said after a moment of reflection. "One that would allow us to preserve both the Institute and your companies without ceding control to Reed." "I've explored all viable alternatives, Sarah. No such option exists at this moment." "Perhaps we're defining viable too conventionally." Sarah straightened her posture as an idea took shape in her mind. "The Institute doesn't need to be a separate entity from your other companies. It could become the core of a complete reimagining of Harrison Enterprises. What do you mean? A transformation, using the principles we've developed for the Institute, integration of traditional and modern knowledge, focus on sustainability and well-being, as the basis for reinventing your companies. The idea was bold, perhaps reckless, but as she articulated it, Sarah felt it had a profound sense. Traditional companies are being challenged by more socially conscious, more sustainable models. What we've learned developing the Institute could be applied to your divisions in construction, technology, services. Maxwell listened with growing attention, his expression gradually transforming from skepticism to serious consideration. It would be a radical restructuring, he finally commented, changing the very DNA of companies with decades of operation in traditional sectors. Exactly. We wouldn't just preserve the Institute, but would convert its principles into the heart of a new type of business conglomerate, one that could attract investors different from the traditional ones, impact funds, organizations committed to sustainability. As they discussed the details, a renewed energy arose between them. The challenge that initially seemed insurmountable began to transform into an opportunity to reinvent not only their individual careers, but their shared vision of the future. Past midnight, when the cafe had closed and they continued their conversation walking through the deserted streets, Maxwell suddenly stopped. "There's something else I need to tell you, Sarah. Something I've postponed for too long." The seriousness in his voice made her stop too, observing him under the soft light of an old street lamp. "During these months, while we were building the Institute, something else has been growing between us." Maxwell carefully chose his words, a bond that goes beyond professional collaboration or even friendship. Sarah felt her heart accelerate. She herself had been aware of that evolution, but both had maintained a prudent distance, focused on the project that united them. "I know," she responded simply. "I wasn't prepared for this," he continued. "After losing Elizabeth, I built walls around my personal life. I took refuge in work, in the role of business leader, of father, of philanthropist, any role that would keep me busy and emotionally safe." "I understand you better than you imagine," Sarah responded. "I've done the same, taking refuge in my identity as a nurse, as a caregiver, as a daughter. And now we find ourselves at this crossroads, where both our shared project and our personal relationship hang by a thread." The silence of the night enveloped them, creating an intimate space in the midst of the sleeping city. "Whatever your decision about Reed's offer, I want you to know that I'll support you," Sarah finally said. "But I also want you to make it considering all dimensions of what's at stake, not just the professional one." Maxwell nodded slowly. "And you? What decision would you make in my place?" The question was profound, transcending the immediate dilemma to touch the very foundations of their life philosophies. "I would choose the path that honored both my responsibilities and my true desires," she responded after reflecting. "Not the one that was easiest or safest, but the one that would allow me to look at myself in the mirror each morning and recognize myself." Her words resonated between them like a fundamental truth, reminding them both why they had connected so deeply from the beginning. They shared a moral compass that valued integrity above convenience. As they returned in silence to their respective homes, both knew that the following morning would bring not only the official presentation of the Institute, but a decision that would redefine the course of their lives, both separate and potentially united. The grand auditorium of Mercy Grace Hospital gleamed under carefully arranged lights. On the stage, a central podium was flanked by arrangements of native medicinal plants instead of traditional ornamental flowers. The walls displayed enlarged photographs of patients from the geriatric unit, before and after implementing the pilot program, along with moving testimonials about their experience. In the front row, Eleanor Winters, elegant in a navy blue suit that Sarah had insisted on buying for the occasion, observed the final preparations with pride. Beside her, Thomas Kirkland, Sarah's childhood friend who had initially tried to convince her to leave the public hospital, now supported her as future coordinator of collaborations between the Institute and private clinics. The seats gradually filled with a heterogeneous mix of attendees, members of the hospital's board of directors, representatives of the International Foundation, doctors, nurses, patients and their families, journalists, and even several traditional healers whom Sarah had specially invited. Backstage, Sarah nervously adjusted her new uniform, a hybrid design between traditional nursing attire and elements inspired by the clothing of the region's healers. Laura approached, impeccable in her formal suit. "Oliver just confirmed that all board members are present," she informed, "and the IFIM representative seems impressed with the preliminary results display." "Any news from Maxwell?" Sarah asked, trying to maintain a casual tone. Laura shook her head. "No one has seen him since last night. His assistant says he had important meetings this morning." Sarah nodded, hiding her concern. After their intense night conversation, Maxwell had promised to inform her of his decision before the ceremony. His absence minutes before the start was worrying. "We should begin," suggested Oliver, checking his watch. "The press is waiting, and we have a tight schedule." "5 more minutes," Sarah requested, "please." Just when the doctor was about to insist, a movement at the entrance caught their attention. Maxwell Harrison was advancing down the central aisle, accompanied by a diverse group. His son Ethan and his daughter-in-law Natalie, 3 executives Sarah recognized from Harrison Enterprises, and surprisingly, an older man of distinguished appearance who generated murmurs among the attendees. "Is that—" Laura began. "Wilson Reed," confirmed Oliver, adjusting his glasses in surprise. "What is Harrison's greatest rival doing here?" Sarah observed the scene with a mixture of confusion and hope. Maxwell located her backstage and gave her a reassuring smile, followed by a gesture she clearly interpreted. "Everything is fine. Trust me." The ceremony began punctually. Dr. William Chambers, chairman of the board of directors, gave the welcome and briefly presented the project's history, from the administrative crisis to the transformative vision of the institute. Laura and Oliver shared the scientific results of the pilot program, especially highlighting the reduction in treatment costs and improved wellness indicators. Finally, the moment came for the formal presentation of the leadership team. Sarah advanced toward the podium, aware of the expectant gazes. Her voice, clear and serene, filled the auditorium. "The Institute for Integrative Medicine that we officially inaugurate today is not simply a new department or an expansion of the hospital. It represents a long-postponed reconciliation between knowledge systems that our society has artificially kept separate." As she developed this idea, her eyes found her mother's in the front row. Eleanor nodded with approval, her eyes bright with contained tears. "This institute honors both the rigorous scientific method and the ancestral wisdom that has sustained entire communities for generations. We don't choose between tradition and modernity, but recognize the complementary value of both perspectives." Sarah paused, looking for Maxwell among the audience. She found him standing by a side door, observing her with an intensity that communicated much more than professional approval. "Now it is an honor to present the person who has been fundamental in materializing this project, contributing not only financial resources, but an extraordinary strategic vision and personal commitment. The co-founder of the Institute and chairman of its board of directors, Maxwell Harrison." Applause accompanied Maxwell as he climbed onto the stage. Upon reaching Sarah, he quickly whispered, "I rejected the offer. I have something better to propose." Before she could respond, he addressed the podium. His speech began with the expected formal thanks, but soon took a surprising turn. "Many of you will wonder why my greatest business competitor, Wilson Reed, is among us today." Maxwell pointed to the older man, who nodded courteously. "The answer is simple. Because today we not only inaugurate a medical institute, but announce an unprecedented business transformation." A murmur ran through the auditorium. Harrison Enterprises and Reed Corporation, after a decade of fierce competition, have agreed to merge their operations under a new entity, the Harrison Reed Foundation for Sustainable Innovation. The revelation provoked exclamations of surprise. Journalists leaned forward, frantically taking notes. This foundation, of which the Institute for Integrative Medicine will be the first flagship initiative, will completely reorient our companies toward a model that integrates environmental sustainability, social responsibility, and economic viability. Maxwell continued explaining how the principles developed for the Institute would gradually be applied to all divisions of the new conglomerate: sustainable construction, accessible technology for underserved communities, recovery of traditional knowledge in various fields. This transformation would not have been possible without the vision of a person who taught me to see beyond financial indicators, reminding me that true wealth is measured in improved lives, not bank accounts. His gaze went directly to Sarah. Nurse Sarah Winters not only saved my wife's life years ago, giving me valuable time with my partner. She also saved my business soul, reminding me of the deeper purpose behind any human endeavor, serving collective well-being. The words, so personal in a formal context, created a moment of shared intimacy amid the public event. Sarah felt her eyes moisten, but maintained the professional composure the occasion required. Maxwell concluded his speech by inviting Wilson Reed to briefly join them on stage. The former rival, now ally, shared a few words about the need to reinvent capitalism for the 21st century, incorporating traditional wisdom and regenerative approaches. When the formal part of the ceremony concluded, attendees were invited to tour a detailed exhibition about the Institute's programs and methodologies. Sarah found herself surrounded by people who wanted to congratulate her, ask questions, or simply share stories about how traditional medicine had impacted their lives. Almost an hour later, when she finally managed to escape the social whirlwind, she found Maxwell waiting for her in a small interior garden, part of the design of the renovated pavilion that would house the Institute. "I imagine you have questions," he said as she approached. "A few," Sarah responded with a smile, "starting with how you convinced your archenemy to join you instead of buying you out." Maxwell sat on a stone bench, inviting her to join him. It turns out Reed has been facing his own existential crisis. His son was diagnosed with a degenerative disease 2 years ago, and conventional medicine offered little hope. They found relief at an integrative medicine center in Switzerland. So when I presented our vision of the Institute and how it could expand to completely transform our companies, I found a much more receptive listener than expected. "It's extraordinary," commented Sarah. "Of all the possible resolutions, this was the one I would have least imagined." "Sometimes the greatest changes arise from the deepest crises," Maxwell reflected, "as you reminded me last night, quoting your grandmother." A comfortable silence settled between them, as they contemplated the small medicinal garden that was already beginning to take shape, with carefully labeled seedlings. "There's another decision I made last night," continued Maxwell after a moment. "One of a more personal nature." Sarah looked at him expectantly, feeling they had reached a turning point not only professionally, but also emotionally. "For years, after losing Elizabeth, I convinced myself that my purpose in life was to build a business legacy, secure my children's future, accumulate enough power to never feel vulnerable again." He paused, his eyes finding hers. "But these months working with you have reminded me that true strength comes not from the walls we build, but from the bridges we extend." From his pocket, he extracted a small object wrapped in a silk handkerchief. Upon unwrapping it, he revealed an ancient stone mortar, the kind traditional healers use to prepare their remedies. It belonged to Elizabeth. She bought it at an artisan market during our last trip together, fascinated by its history. The seller told her it had been in the same family of healers for 7 generations. With delicacy, he placed the small mortar in Sarah's hands. "I want you to have it, not as a symbol of farewell or closure, but as an acknowledgement of continuity, of how past and present can intertwine to create something new and beautiful." Sarah held the object with reverence, understanding the profound meaning of the gesture. It wasn't simply a gift. It was a way of honoring both the woman Maxwell had loved and the path that now opened before them. "It's beautiful," she finally said, running her fingers over the surface worn by decades of use. "And I'm deeply honored that you want me to have it." "There's an inscription on the base," Maxwell pointed out. "Almost imperceptible but significant." Sarah turned the mortar and squinted to distinguish the words faintly engraved in the stone. "To heal others, first heal your heart." "That's what you've done for me, Sarah," Maxwell said with a soft but firm voice. "You've helped me heal in ways I never imagined possible." In that moment, surrounded by medicinal plants that symbolized the integration of tradition and modernity they had achieved together, both understood they had reached the threshold of a new stage, not just for the Institute or the newly created foundation, but for them as individuals and as a potential couple. "The path won't be easy," warned Sarah, always pragmatic, even in moments of deep emotion. "Transforming entire industries, changing healthcare paradigms, and also exploring this that's growing between us. The best paths are rarely the easiest," Maxwell responded with a smile. "But they're infinitely more satisfying when traveled in good company." As the afternoon sun filtered its golden light through the leaves of the medicinal plants, projecting dancing patterns on the garden floor, Sarah and Maxwell remained seated in silence, aware that this moment marked not an end but a glorious beginning. As her grandmother had taught her, and as she would now teach others through the Institute, true healing always occurs in circles. What we receive, we return. What we learn, we transmit. And in that eternal exchange, we find our place in the great fabric of existence. The ancient stone mortar rested between them like a tangible bridge between past and future, between loss and renewal, between solitude and companionship. A reminder that the deepest roots are what allow the strongest wings to grow.